Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 85, and as always, I'm your show's host, Kyle. In today's show, I'm going to be talking about the war coming home a little bit, so just a little bit different topic than the typical show, but I think I got some interesting insights and stories that to share, good arguments that'll help you to understand a little bit what impacts of the war are at home as well as abroad. So if you have any friends or family who really don't give a care about, the Middle East and couldn't find Saudi Arabia or Iran on a map anyways, and you want to direct them towards today's show to try to convince them maybe of a few foreign policy issues and stuff like that, please go ahead and share the show. Sharing the show makes a difference. Those episodes that are shared do get more downloads, simple as that. So I hope I have a catchy headline. I hope, it's something that everybody wants to listen to, and that when after you listen to it, you're inspired. You're like, wow, that was really good. I'm going to share it. So if that's the case, go ahead and click the share button. If it's not, you could send me an email, a message on Facebook. I'm at kylesfilesblog.com, at gmail.com for email, or on Facebook at Kyle's Files. Alright, so let's start it off, and what really got me in the mood to talk about this today was that Trump is looking at undoing a Obama ban that sold surplus military supplies to local police departments. Now, this has long been an issue for some groups, particularly libertarians or those on the maybe progressive/socialist kind of left, who have been very worried about the militarization of police. I think the left probably experienced some of that, and has a history of in America, especially the socialists, Red Scare, McCarthyism, being persecuted by the police, and so they have a concern about that. And libertarians are generally good about understanding the destructive nature of the state, and that the more weapons that the local police department has, the more doors they're going to kick down, the more people they're going to shoot. But this story really caught the nation's attention. I believe it was really after the death of Michael Brown and then the following riots or protests, however you want to describe them, in Ferguson. Now, not to wade too deep into the Michael Brown and then Black Lives Matter controversy, but, the response from police was at times very severe, looking like you essentially had an army coming up against a group of protesters and firing tear gas into the streets and doing this to break up protest. Now, were some of these protesters who had tear gas fired at them and were marched on by essentially a paramilitary force doing violent acts? I think if you look at the film, you could say, oh yeah, these people are burning cars and these people are burning down stores. And the, police were marching in to maybe make room for fire trucks or whatever. And we could talk about whether that was justified or not. But at the same time, you also had groups of just, seemingly peaceful people out in the streets, hands up, don't shoot, and were then treated the same way and were marched on by a paramilitary force and had tear gas fired in their eyes and were arrested. It was very disgusting. I think anybody who's just an American or somebody who wants to live in a civilized society, no matter how you really feel about whatever issue, one of the things you don't want to see are people in armor, carrying machine guns or shotguns or, tear gas, grenade launch style weaponry on a group of protesters, and you also don't want those protesters setting stuff on fire. I mean, these aren't the ways we should work out our problems. We have words, we're an intelligent species. We don't have to resort to shooting each other and burning each other's stuff in order to get a peaceful result. But, this is what happened. These are the images, and this led Obama to put a ban on these local military or local police forces buying up these surplus military goods. Now, a couple of things important about the surplus military supplies. A lot of them are from the Iraq or Afghanistan war, either that weren't used but were ordered, or maybe they did see some use, but the military has now upgraded to a new model or a new form of weaponry, and so these are extra, they're surplus. At times, the federal government or state governments will actually grant their local police departments money to buy these. The military will sell them for cheap, on the cheap and stuff like this. And so now you have, small New Hampshire towns driving around in armored vehicles with a machine gun nest on the top. And, you would think in a town with a couple thousand people, how could that ever possibly be necessary? And isn't it really disturbing that they're using this? But this is a result of the war. If you don't have a 17-year long, prolonged, drawn out war in the Middle East where America is fighting on several endless fronts, you don't have the American government spending trillions of dollars, 2, 3, who knows how many trillions of dollars over in the Middle East right now. and we don't have, two to three generations of different military, vehicles and units out there. We've been there so long that, there's a whole new generation, not just of men, but of machines fighting the war. And, they're now going to start fighting the war with the F-35, and they were looking at, phasing out the A-10 Warthog and the F-16 and stuff. But at the same time, what we're seeing is that there's just so much going over there that some of it's coming back. And it's ending up in the hands of these police units. It got to the point where were even some school districts, like some larger city school districts or departments of education that actually had their own SWAT teams with armed people. And you just think to yourself, do we really want our Department of Education armed and all this stuff? And not only are these weapons going just to the local police forces, but they're also going to federal agencies. One of the things that surprised me a lot about the Bundy Ranch standoff was when you had all these federal agencies, not just the FBI, not the people you would think have guns, but the Bureau of Land Management was showing up to this ranch in what looked like a small army unit. They had armored vehicles, they had automatic weapons, they had Kevlar vests, they had riot shields, and you would think, what could the Bureau of Land Management ever need this for, and why is this agency armed to the teeth? And so if you're somebody who doesn't like a large and very violent police force at home, then you have to stand against the foreign policy, because the foreign policy creates a situation where you have so much militarization of the police because of the extra weaponry sold from the military to the police. I mean, who else is this weaponry going to go to? If it sits there and rusts, then it looks really bad on the politicians. Anytime they show, one of these big yards of old military equipment rusting away, it makes our current politicians look bad. And so this is the way they could give it a home. Of course, too, you also have, people with all this military training, and they disproportionately come back home and become members of law enforcement. And I think, again, this is a militarization of the police force, because these men do have a military mindset. And when, this is their object, the way they learned law enforcement was through counterinsurgency programs in foreign countries. And so when you go and work someplace new, you take some of what you know with you, and maybe some of it could be useful in a sense on the job. But once again, do we want our police officers acting like counterinsurgency soldiers? This isn't a good thing. The next, and I think the biggest issue for at least Americans, is the war debt. And I don't think this is anything that Americans understand at all. With the Bush policy, we were promised that we would build a better Iraq, and, people talked about taking the oil from the Middle East and stuff like this in order to pay for the war. You also have the enduring myth that came out of the World War II Great Depression era, where everybody says that the Great Depression, or the World War II, brought the United States out of the Great Depression. This is one of the most destructive myths in American history, and really nobody debunks it better than Robert Murphy. So if anybody wants to go, or Tom Woods, to go and look, just Google Robert Murphy or Tom Woods, World War II. Great Depression. I'm sure you would find several great articles and podcast shows really detailing about this myth, because like I said, it's a super destructive myth. The war debt will continue to take money out of the pockets of Americans for generations to come. We're not talking about the current taxpayers having to fork over a little bit of extra money for their short and cheap war they're fighting. We're talking about we've taken trillions of dollars on in war debt, in the debt of our national defense, that we're spending all this extra money because of all these wars. And so when you look at it and you think that your great grandchildren will probably be paying, a few $100s a month, if depending on what the dollar's worth at that time, just to attempt to pay off this war debt. I mean, America isn't really making any progress on the debt it has right now. It's not like we have this 30-year plan where we pay off all of our debt and then everything, the budget sheets all line up and then we start turning a profit and everything's great. I mean, even most of these congressional plans, they don't even start to cut the rate of growth for the first few years. And so looking at this, endless debt that we're plaguing on our country, it's simply a burden that why would you ever assign to anyone? Imagine trying to run a business and you have taken on so much debt at the beginning that for the next 50 years down the road, you're going to be paying 25% of your profits, your revenue a month, and debt would just be too much for almost anybody to bear. And the United States will not be exempt from this in the long term. A lot of this debt has been paid for in the form of inflation, which is monetary, creating new money, printing new dollar bills. It wasn't taxed from the people. We just, created more dollars to pay for the wars. Inflation is a hidden tax. It slowly erodes the value of your money. So if you're somebody who's struggling to get by and gas is getting more expensive and your electric bills getting more expensive and your milk and your meat and everything else you buy and eat and need to survive, your rent, your cars, everything's getting more and more expensive, and you scratch your head and you wonder why. Well, it's because we're fighting a 17-year war overseas and the government's had to print, billions, hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars in order to help to defer the cost of that giant and wasteful military exercise. And so now, you're losing a small percentage of your wealth every single year and you just don't realize it. And also that, will lead to booms and busts in the economy, printing all this money, creating a whole bunch of problems. But I just feel comfortable leaving it there and then moving on to the next one, which is the amount of wealth lost and the misallocation of resources. So let's to talk about the lost wealth. Every dollar that we spend on the military is a dollar that we don't spend in a free economy or doing something else with, right? While security is certainly important, it's something that, people need to look into and will have to apportion a certain amount of their wealth or resources to. The fact that the U.S. government spends, $600, billion, and then if you include the war debt, $1 trillion a year on national defense, it's way out of proportion in what it's going to fight all these offensive wars that make us less safe. And so at this point in time, if America would spend that money on virtually anything else, and I mean, even if we're just giving it away to people, dropping it out of helicopters, at least it's not going to doing something that's going to make us less safe. And so if you think about just every single dollar that's taken out of the U.S. economy and then reassigned to the military is, if we could leave it in business, how many more small businesses would start? How much more technology could be advanced? How much cheaper could food prices be or electric prices? How much more could we use, the same metals and machinery? Thinking about the misallocation of resources. If you're looking at building a tank or looking at building construction equipment, I mean, largely they're probably using the same resources. Of course, the tank's going to fire something explosive eventually, but when you look at the large motors, the steels, the oil, all that kind of stuff that goes into building that maybe bulldozer and look at going into building the tank, that certain amount of metal could only go into building one or the other. And if you assign it to the tank, it's going to go overseas and maybe get exploded, but at the very best, just one day go and sit in a huge rust pile and never really create any wealth for anybody. Where if you had the bulldozer, it could go on to, plow a bunch of fields, and that way you could build new stuff there. You could do all this great stuff with the construction equipment that you can't do with the deconstruction equipment that you have in all these missiles and tanks and other stuff. If you think about all the engineers, these brilliant people who go and work for these companies like Boeing and Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, and they build weapons of war rather than ways to make the human race more advanced and better. And, people sometimes say, well, the military developed this and then other people, were able to use that technology. And it's like, well, that's great when that happens, but look at all the times that the military developed something that could only go to blow people up. All these nuclear weapons that we spent trillions of dollars on. The new F-35 project that's going to cost nearly $1 trillion is worse than the current planes that the United States already flies. Imagine if all those engineers and brilliant people went, rather than trying to create a plane that could take off vertically and shoot things close on the ground and also dogfight, they develop a new plane that's twice as big as the other one and uses half the amount of fuel. I mean, what would it do? How much wealthier would every citizen be if air travel was $15 a ticket rather than $100? And obviously I don't know that would happen, but just looking at being able to put these resources in different places and seeing that, hey, all this other stuff could happen is what Adam Smith talked about in The Invisible Hand. That whenever you waste the money on these government and military projects that net us nothing but weapons of destruction, you lose all the ability to construct and learn and develop new technologies by putting that money in a free economy. We also have the sanctions too, and if you look at how U.S. sanctions have interfered in business between China and the U.S. and the U.S. and Russia, But a good example is just that Apple recently had to take all of its Iranian-made apps off the market because of U.S. sanctions. If you look in countries like Venezuela, they're not able to sell oil as easily or as cheaply to the U.S. because of sanctions put in place there. And all these sanctions, prevent the free flow of trade, meaning that resources aren't able to go to their most productive ends and have to go to some other end, which, less productive, meaning that overall the human race is losing out in some way. And then we also just had the disruption that the wars caused. Think about all the oil wells that first Saddam and then the ISIS guys have now set on fire in Iraq. All the oil, all the infrastructure that was wasted whenever, they performed these acts, and this was only caused because of the war, or all the disruption in the shipping lanes because United States ships are flowing everywhere, pretty much around the Arabian Peninsula and even in the South China Sea. And just, things are less secure in the Middle East. They're less stable because of the United States intervention there. Look at, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan. All those countries are the least stable countries in the region, largely because of U.S. interventionism. We also have the issue of disabled veterans that I know I talked about this one before, but again, it's nice to be able to say that we're going to protect Americans by sending them overseas to fight, but you're not protecting the Americans that you send to fight, 100%. Even if the idea is true that radical Islamic terrorists are somehow a danger to the United States, that's essentially, and that they're not created by blowback, you are still putting some people at risk. The people you send overseas to fight and die are still being put at risk because you're sending them over there. And so we come back with all these disabled veterans, and some men actually lose their lives. And if you think about this, these are some of the most physically gifted and intellectually gifted young men and women in the entire United States who decide to list in the army and go fight for their country. And if they were able to do other things in the U.S., how much more, productive could they be? How much cheaper could they make all of our products? Because the workers, working in all these places are able to just perform at a higher level. And so hopefully one day we end up with a situation where we could bring some of these young men home and they could do jobs at home that don't disable them, don't end up with them dead. Also, many of these young men are, get married or are fathers, and then their children are, lose their parents, possibly just having their parents out of their lives for a significant amount of their childhood while they're overseas. And all these things, especially when we come to the subject of the disabled veterans and the lost men and women, I think this explains some of it has been called xenophobia in America. I think maybe a better way to describe it would just be some of the more nationalist tendencies that seem to have formed in America over the past 25 years or so, where people say Americans are less tolerant of immigrants and are less willing to accept immigrants and all this. And who knows if it's true or not, but if it is true, one of the first places you would have to look is the interventionism. When people lose somebody in their lives, they don't always think rationally about the death and what caused it and everything like that. If we just look at how people refer to and treat cancer, and they're in a battle with cancer, they're fighting cancer. Sometimes when they give like pep talks and talk about how they beat cancer, it sounds very militaristic. Like they went out there and they had this plan and they execute the plan, operating all these things, and like great, awesome, you're beating cancer. I'm not trying to criticize that talk or anything, but I think when things tend to cause death, we often have that association with them that they have to be dealt with militaristically, and we have this kind of groupthink mentality. Everybody walks around saying F cancer or cancer's a B or stand up to cancer and all this stuff, and we have all this, and that same kind of idea translates to people overseas who tend to kill Americans. And so when you send 100,000 Americans to Afghanistan and 2,200 of them come back dead, or 200,000 or so Americans to Iraq and 5,000 or so then end up dead, there starts to build a resentment in the population. They're mad that their relatives are dying, and because their relatives are dying, especially these aren't people dying of old age. I mean, these are young men and women dying in the absolute prime of their lives. Their parents are probably seeing them like having the potential to achieve all these great things, and then they go overseas and some guy who never knew the name of your son detonated a suicide bomb and blew your son up for no good reason, and you're pissed as hell about it. And so I don't think it necessarily should be surprising that there's, starts to be this nationalism and hatred for Arabs whenever that the United States has been putting troops in the Middle East for the past 17 years and watching them die. We also have the FBI increasing, just their tireless pursuit at looking at like they're catching terrorists. We've seen time and time and again all these sting operations that FBI is setting up. Again, this creates more of a fear of Muslims because 500 I think or so times now since 9/11 the FBI has entrapped some poor dumb Muslim kid into going to the store and buying some supplies that may be used for a bomb. And while the kid would never carried out any terrorist attack without any FBI intervention at all, the FBI talking to him and getting them all riled up got him to go out and buy these supplies, and now suddenly Americans are like, oh my god, all these Muslims are trying to blow us up. Last thing, and I'll go over this one quickly because I think most people understand it at the pretty basic level, and that is lost freedoms. Of course, this all got kicked off with George Bush and his delusional, they hate us for our freedoms. I'm not even going to invalidate that with much of a response. But if you look at what it's like to go through an airport, they're looking at putting body scanners in the major subway systems in the United States. There are checkpoints, quote unquote border checkpoints that are up to like 80 miles from the U.S.-Mexican border. When police stop you, they have more ability to search you, and, they could track your purchases and all this kind of stuff, money transfers over $10,000, because they're always worried about terrorism. They listen to all of our phone calls because they're worried about terrorism, even though that nets them absolutely nothing. They can't catch a terrorist by recording everybody's phone call, but they're going to do it and tell you it's because of that reason anyways. So I hope everybody enjoyed this. This was, me just trying to go over, like, what are all the impacts on us Americans at home. Sometimes I don't like to talk about this stuff just because it seems so much worse to me that 16 Yemeni children got killed by a U.S.-made bomb when a U.S. Refueling plane allowed a Saudi bomber to go and blow up a target that was selected by, U.S. and Saudi intelligence agencies. But it is important to remind Americans of everything that we're losing, even if it's a couple $100 and I have to, get pat down every time I go to the airport. I don't think that really compares, to a whole family game blowing up, but it matters. Other news stories, and I'll try to be quick with them, and that is North Korea tested 3 missiles over the weekend, and 3 for 3 all fails. In the past, Michael Miles has speculated that some of the missile test failures are actually designed by North Korea because it's a way for them to save face and not increase tensions at the same time. We have 10 Somali civilians killed by U.S. and Somali forces in a Somalian village. Originally, there was some claims that, oh no, these were Al-Shabaab members. There was a report that the civilians were executed by the United States and Somali soldiers. I'm still looking into to see exactly what happened here, but we do seem to have confirmation that it was U.S. and Somali forces that killed them, and they were at least 10 civilians. In Sierra Leone, we have 1,000 people dying in a mudslide. In Afghanistan, I read an interesting article about what America's possible motives could be in kind of keeping China out of Afghanistan. Afghanistan does have a small land bridge that cuts between, I think, Pakistan and Uzbekistan into China. And so they do share a very small border. Afghanistan has a very large lithium market, and apparently most of the lithium market is controlled by U.S. companies, so there's a lot of speculation that that's part of the reason that the U.S. seems to be so involved in Afghanistan. Also, there are a lot of NATO outposts in Afghanistan, and so keeping all those NATO outposts there is a way to keep China out and from expanding to that region. Of course, Afghanistan sits on the other side of China as Pakistan, so Pakistan, kind of sits between, and India. So there could be, regional motivation for China to be more involved in Afghanistan for that reason. We had 30 killed at a Shia mosque in Afghanistan, and ISIS is claiming responsibility for the attack. Pakistan claims that Afghanistan army forces are selling their weapons that America gives them to the Taliban. I didn't see them provide any proof that this was happening, but it seems like something that could pretty easily happen. The Iraqi army is saying they control Tel Afar. Tel Afar is a city northwest of Mosul in Iraq, and it was one of the largest cities still held by ISIS in Iraq. The Iraqi army tends to declare victory early in cities, but this still seems to be a pretty swift defeat at Tel Afar, so I'll try to keep up to date on any more stories coming out of there. We have the U.S. saying they will not change course in Raqqa after a UN report said that the U.S. was killing way too many civilians in Raqqa. it seems to be the case that the United States is pretty much just dropping a bomb on any ISIS position in Raqqa. It doesn't seem like the ISIS took the city of Madadin, I believe is how it's said, from the Syrian Arab Army. This is one of the first stories I've read of ISIS gaining any territory in quite a while. I read a story about Syrian war veterans, specifically veterans of the Syrian Arab Army, saying that they're having a hard time getting any care from the Syrian government after they come home disabled. In Yemen, we have 16 killed by a Saudi Arabian airstrike. Again, Saudi Arabia said this was a good target, even though 16 civilians died in it. And in Venezuela, we have the Venezuelan government, or Maduro, using the sanctions against Venezuela by the United States as propaganda against the Venezuelan opposition. Effectively, what we have is the Venezuelan government using our sanctions against us. And so again, sanctions are stupid and do not work. Alright everybody, that'll wrap up my show for today. I hope everybody enjoyed the show. Did a little bit of a different topic today, but I thought it was fun, different, interesting. If you liked it, share it. The website for the podcast is foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. My Facebook page is Kyle's Files. You can find the show on iTunes, Foreign Policy Focus. Share, rate, review. And I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. The personal website is kylesfilesblog.com, and I'm a blogger on the Libertarian Institute.